Hey, everybody, welcome to the Crit House. I'm Jeff Larson, and we are continuing our My Five series here, where we ask photographers and photo professionals to talk about 5 images that have some meaning for them. And today we have Rubin, M.H. Rubin.
Hey.
How are you? Thanks for joining us. Rubin is a photographer. He is also an author with a book that has been recently published, and he's a podcaster as well. His podcast is called Everyday Photography Every Day. And his book is called The Photography as Haiku. When you talk about yourself as a photographer, how do you describe yourself? How do you think of yourself other than being an amateur? I mean, what's the way that you view yourself?
Most of the time you hear from photographers who are professionals. They're at National Geographic, or they're fine artists and they've got a Guggenheim and they've been in tons of galleries. But I feel like for 40 years, my experiences as just a guy with a camera, and I feel like my experiences growing up with a camera, growing up with images, is really more like the average person holding an iPhone. You know, the way you live your life when it's not your job, when it's not your career, but you are always empowered with a camera. I feel like the way I've lived gives me interesting insights into what a lot of people experience with taking pictures. So I don't come to it as like I'm a famous photographer. I come to it as somebody who's spent 40 or 50 years looking through a lens and just integrating it into a normal life, or just other stuff that isn't assignments in Iraq, but pictures of my kids, kinds of stuff. Yeah. And so I try to bring my feelings about photography just to everyday photography, and so that's how the podcast evolved, and that's sort of how I think of myself. I'm just an amateur. I love photography.
So I asked you to look at talk about 5 images, and then you had to think through the millions of images that are out there, which 5 you were going to choose. What did you go through when you were sort of thinking about that? How did you decide on 5 images?
Well, it's a brutal question. I don't know if your other guests have told you, like it's
nobody on likes the edge
it. It's on the edge of cruel, right? Because the more versed you are at photography, it's like, who could pick 5? I think I even sent you 6.
I'm sorry.
I sent you 6. You're like 5. And
you had to cut out one of my favorites as well.
I know, isn't that brutal?
Darn Harry Callahan. Yeah.
I feel that I learned photography from looking at photography, right? I learned without classes of any kind, and I always believed that learning photography would be an emergent property of just staring at enough photos. You'd find what you liked, what you were attracted to, what was working, what wasn't. Yeah. So for most of my life, I sort of pointed at maybe 50 photos that really influenced me growing up. They were on the walls of my house. My parents collected photography, and so that was the primary inspiration. And I met a lot of fine art photographers as just people, and so sometimes you couldn't separate out how much you liked the guy from how much you liked the pictures he took, right? So I think in selecting the 5, I was thinking about, of everything I grew up with, what changed my thinking? What were the sort of the nodal points in my evolution in looking at pictures and thinking about pictures that even led to my current sort of philosophy of learning photography, which is about haiku. These pictures that I picked aren't necessarily haiku, although some of them are in my thinking, but they definitely taught me to start thinking about these attributes. So what these pictures did inspired me, and I started seeing a lot of those attributes in many photographs. And I'm not talking about the content per se. It's not like the subject matter is what I'm talking about. As we start going into this, it was really about the structures of what made pictures good pictures, aside from whether I had particular interest in the subject, like, oh, I love the wilderness, or I love Manhattan. It's not that kind of a selection. You know what I mean?
Well, let's go see what you mean.
Let's see what I mean. I don't know. Let's see what I mean. Yeah.
So you start with Jerry Uelsmann, and I'll have to say, as a youth I remember seeing Jerry Uelsmann's images, and long before I ever picked up a camera, and being influenced by his work as well.
Me too. So this picture, which is called Apocalypse 2, which Uelsmann made in 1967, was near my crib. You know, it was in my bedroom. So no pink elephants and whatever, like this kind of creepy stuff was what I stared at, like lying in bed. It was the genesis of many childhood nightmares.
This is a little bit of your origin story right here, right?
This is my origin story, but this picture and a couple others from the late 60s by Uelsmann really were the kinds of things that fascinated me and made me, you know, want to be a photographer. Jerry Uelsmann was my dad's, probably his best friend, and Uelsmann taught my mom photography, built the darkroom in our house. I kind of apprenticed myself to him, and my early photography looked like this. Wow. This is what I was trying to do. I kind of felt like if you were just pushing a button on a camera, you were phoning it in. You know, like the work is in the darkroom of coming up with these cool things and then making them. And I liked the craft of hanging out all afternoon in the darkroom and playing around with how things looked when they were put together. But the reason I chose it for this is because, like a lot of Uelsmann's stuff, he's really about what happens when you juxtapose things. When you go, like, this is a relatively simple series of images. It's a tree that's been mirrored in negative, and then there's kind of almost a hard line, and then there's just people at the beach at the bottom. If you saw each part of this separately, it might not even register as anything that interesting. It's not like, oh my God, that's amazing, I'm gonna use that piece. He's seeing past that. And what I realized was that this is really a case where the sum of the parts is way greater than, you know, the individual elements. This picture is creepy and mysterious and haunting, but the elements are really pretty ordinary. And so what this taught me was how important juxtaposition is. You know what I mean? How important, you know, what happens when you put things together. And I felt you could only really do those sorts of juxtapositions in the darkroom. So that's how I started in my photography. Honestly, what I'd like to go to after this really is the Urwit. And so after Uelsmann, and I thought, like, darkroom is it. Like, that is photography, and everything else is stupid and cheap and easy. And then in the late 70s, I was introduced to Elliot Urwit's work. And what I realized with Urwit was that he was very much like Uelsmann. It was still about juxtapositions, but he was catching them in real life and not making them in the darkroom. And I thought that was fascinating. And both Urwit and Uelsmann are funny guys, like silly adults. And again, it really made me think that's the job you want to have, right? You want to, if you're going to be a photographer. So Urwit took the juxtapositions of Uelsmann and moved me out of just pure darkroom work into this idea that there's something in the coincidence of things in a frame and how you look at the picture triggering something in you. Like your eye goes to the little dog, its delight, and the feet, and it takes you a moment before you recognize the second dog's legs there. And in that moment is a kind of an inner laugh. You know, you can feel it. It's delightful. And that's what Urwit was who I wanted to be. I mean, Uelsmann is why I wanted to be a photographer, but Urwit made me realize it didn't have to be just fine art construction in a darkroom, but actually how you see things. And Urwit also talked about that, you know, he found photography was largely about how you see things, not the things themselves. So Urwit really moved me past the Uelsmann stage into taking pictures.
My favorite part about what you have just said is how respectfully you have referred to silly adults.
Silly adults.
We need more silly adults.
And both, again, Uelsmann, Urwit, these are guys, I mean, they're fun. They're fun. You want to be fun. I wanted to be fun. And Uelsmann was a funny guy. His house was full of strange objects and little doodads and things, and everywhere you looked was like a delightful discovery. But even in his physical home, it was about juxtaposition, the silliness of of a stuffed moose head, a plush toy moose head with a camera around his neck and dealy boppers on his head. And you think, that's funny, weird. And so I really came to that aesthetic, and Urwit really moved that forward.
Well, your number 3 image, perhaps less silly adult, although I don't know.
Not
Ansel
silly
Adams
adult,
individually.
although Adams was also kind of a childlike adult. I think I didn't know him personally, but this picture in particular triggered something in me. It was right around this time, I was trying to think about how to explain photography. Like, what is it that makes the pictures I like interesting? Like, what is that feature? And I loved this picture. And then it was somewhere around this time that I started learning about haiku. And in haiku, there's a kind of a structure that says there's the thing you see, and then a moment later, a little thing that changes how you feel about the thing you see. In haiku, there's a cutting word that breaks a haiku from 3 short lines into 2 lines and 1 line.
Mm-hmm.
And the 2 lines are the big thing. It's what you think is going on. It's what you think this is about. And then the 1 line is a kind of a little twist, a little something, And so I thought that was a really interesting idea when I looked at that Urwit. That was like, oh yeah, you see the dog, and then you see the legs of the other dog, and you have a kind of a laugh, right?
Right.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting that Urwit does that. And then I looked at this Ansel Adams, and how did I break this down? You've got this massive, beautiful range of mountains, the range of light. This is lone pine. This is winter sunrise lone pine. And your eye goes to that. And the photo is large. And you see this thing. And then a moment later, you see the little horse down there. And it's really in the discovery of the little horse that is like that twist. It's a little thing that changes us from a kind of a static landscape to a kind of a poignant moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you didn't have that horse, it's like a million landscapes, but the horse changes it. And I thought, that's the structure of haiku. How fascinating. I wonder if it's just Ansel Adams. So I went back and looked at the pictures that really influenced me. And the next one by Imogen Cunningham is called The Unmade Bed. And I remembered looking at this picture and feeling like, God, these sheets, I will never look at sheets again and not see the lusciousness of the sheets. But then after I thought about haiku, I saw the sheets like that range of mountains in the Adams. And I saw the little hairpins like the little horse. Like, go back and forth between those two. It's almost the same compositional structure in a sense. So this is how it started solidifying in my head that, like, I think a lot of the pictures that I like have this structure. I won't go into the entire philosophy of what haiku is and how I kind of discovered that in these pictures, but this is how it began. This is how the influence, both the juxtapositions in the Uelsmann and the funniness and the juxtaposition in the Urwit, and now in Adams and Cunningham, I'm seeing this. It's not a form. It's not like a rule of thirds, but it is a conceptual structure that pictures that I liked the most seem to be like this. They had the thing you see, and then you discovered something, and it was delightful. So on top of all the sort of formalities of haiku and the formalities in composition that you have in these pictures, that is the most underlying principle of haiku. And I was seeing it reflected over and over in the photographs that influenced me.
So you have done just an amazing job of letting me understand what your book at least is about. So I'm fascinating to read it. But here, so your 5th image, I'm interested to hear how that haiku works with this. Tell me, because initially when as you've been talking about it, and I've been thinking about, well, wait a second, how does that work with Michael Kenna?
That's right. That's right. And I had the same thing. So when I had these sort of 50 influential pictures, many of them were like those 2 rhythmic beats, those uneven rhythmic beats that you saw in the Cunningham and the Adams and the Urwit. But there was a group that didn't do that, like at Weston's Pepper 30 or Callahan's, some of Callahan's Eleanor and Michael Kenna and Cortege. And I was like, for a while, I just lumped them in another group. But as I started to look at them and think about them, I realized it also has these 2 beats. And they just are created differently. It's not, like I said, it's not how you do it. It's just the net effect of having these two beats. So for Kenna and Weston, what happens is you look at the picture and imagine there's a continuum between a photo that is completely obvious, just like a picture of an apple sitting there, and a picture that's completely cryptic, that you stare at it and you're like, I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know what that is. And it's sort of unsatisfying. If I just show it to you, that's kind of unsatisfying. And if I just make it cryptic, that's kind of unsatisfying. But these pictures like Pepper 30 and Kenna's photo here of the Golden Gate Bridge, by the way, are pictures where you look at it and your initial feeling is, huh? Like, what is that? It's an abstraction. And then because these people are masters, they're right at the kind of the fulcrum between cryptic and obvious, where you go, huh? And then, oh, that discovery of the little horse, or the discovery of the hairpins, is equivalent emotionally to the discovery of what you're looking at. So you have this kind of oh rhythm, and your skill as a photographer, or my skill as a photographer, is trying to hit that point. Now, not everybody sees things the same way, and of course there's a lot of variability there, but as a poet, that's what I'm playing with. Can I show it to you so you're not quite sure what you have, and then you get it? And that's on top of the other attributes, like it's just beautiful formality, you know, it's simplicity. These are haiku ideas. And this picture really reflected that for me. This and Pepper 30 and a couple others were the epiphany, I would say, that both the two beats could be created in lots of different ways. And I like this way too. It's a kind of a different thing that I play with. So that's why I showed this. And I would say the other reason I included it is that it was the last photo that my father got in our collection. And it was only because he had maybe 100 Michael Kennas that he donated to a museum late in his life. And I remember him telling me one day he had made this donation. And I thought, you donated 100 pictures. You couldn't have donated 98? Like, couldn't you just kept a couple of my favorites? And I told him what my favorites were and why. And for my birthday, he went and got this again and gave it to me. And so it bookends from the Uelsmann, which is really the beginning of the collection that my father and my parents put together. And this Kenna is sort of the last picture. And my whole education is sort of wrapped up in there. But I love this photo. It's in my living room right now, and I see it every day, and I never get tired of it. It's always delightful. Even knowing what it is, it still produces that kind of beauty, simplicity, rhythm, poetry. So that's why that one's in here.
Well, Rubin, thank you. What a great conversation. What a you have. This is why I do this. You have opened my eyes to photography in a way that I had never considered before. And so I honor you for that, and I thank you for that. Just a pleasure talking to you. For all of you out there, if you are interested in being on the Crit House and showing your 5 images, then please go on to Instagram and post your 5 images using the hashtag #my5, and then also tag us at the Crit House as well. Rubin, thank you so much. And thank you all for watching the Crit House.